I am a PhD student at Center for Political Studies, JNU. It's a pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of JNU Academic to today's public lecture titled Marxism for the 21st Century, Pertinence of Universalism and Reason. We are honored to host Professor Vivek Chibber, one of the most prominent Marxist thinkers of our time. But before we begin, let me say a few words about JNU Academic. JNU Academic is an independent forum that strives to enrich the graduate community by organizing talks such as these on themes that are of social relevance. As you know, JNU Academic is an entirely student-driven forum, and for us to organize events such as these, we need your support. So kindly contribute as much as you can. There are two ways through which you can contribute to JNU Academic, either through hard cash, and since not many people carry cash these days, you can contribute through UPI as well. During the course of the lecture, we'll circulate a QR code. You may scan the code and contribute to JNU Academic. Thanks. Now let me formally introduce Professor Vivek Chibber. Professor Chibber is a professor of sociology at New York University and author of several influential books that have shaped contemporary debates on Marxism. He is also the editor of Catalyst, the Journal of Theory and Strategy. His first book, Locked in Place, State Building and Late Industrialization in India, is a highly regarded book in which he analyzes India's post-colonial industrial strategy and state building. In 2005, the book was awarded Barrington Moore Jr. Prize by the American Sociological Association. His widely debated post-colonial theory and spectre of capital offers a forceful critique of subaltern studies and post-colonial theory and makes a compelling case for the continued relevance of Marxist universalism. In the class matrix, Social Theory After the Cultural Turn, he challenged the culturalist turn in the social theory and reasserts the centrality of class analysis. His most recent book, Confronting Capitalism, How the World Works and How to Change It, presents a clear and accessible introduction to Marxist political economy. It maps the core dynamics of capitalism while offering insights into the possibilities of building emancipatory politics today. Across his body of work, Professor Chibber defends the role of reason, universalism, and class analysis as essential tools for confronting the multiple crises of 21st century. Without taking further time, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Vivek Chibber.
Thank you, Rahil. Should I hold this? It's such a powerful mic. I think if I feel like I should be singing a song if I do. Is there a stand? Maybe. Are we disturbing you? Go ahead. Maybe good time is done. Need to make a phone call, right? Okay. I do what I'm told. And I was told today to give a talk on the future of Marxism, or Marxism for the 21st century, and its relationship to the Enlightenment tradition more generally, but to liberalism, to reason, to rationality. I'll do it, but I do wonder who's interested in these things anymore these days. And since this is India, as we all know, reason and rationality is foreign. And since this is JNU, I should especially stress that the subalterns don't think in linear, reasonable, rational thought. So let me, however, see if some of the things I say may find some traction, even in this hallowed ground. What we want to talk about is, first of all, what the scope for the recovery and the resuscitation of Marxism might be in the 21st century, and what the social forces are that could aid and abet in that recovery. Can we fix that? Okay. Maybe we turn the volume down? चलेगा नहीं. Better? Yeah. Now you just hear me, right? Okay. There is no other way to put this. Marxism today is largely dead. Maybe the kinder way to put it is that it's on life support, on the verge of death. And it's an open question whether it'll ever regain consciousness again. Part of the task of progressives today, I think, is that even if it is on life support, this isn't going to work.
How about I just talk? Can you all hear me?
All right, let's try this. The question is twofold. Why did Marxism go into decline? And the second thing is, how can it be recovered? And if it is to be recovered, what's its relationship to the broader political culture and political environment within which we find ourselves today? So I want to start with the factors that go into the decline of Marxism, and then what the cultural and political consequences of that are, because those consequences are what we find ourselves living in today, not just in the United States or Europe, but also in India, and I would say especially in India, which was once the place of one of the most powerful and vibrant Marxist movements, socialist movements in the world, but is today a place where that tradition is, much like in the rest of the world, at best on life support and politically almost irrelevant. So how did we get here? Well, the answer is not difficult to foresee. The basic causes that decline of Marxism were social and material. In other words, they were the obverse of what enabled its rise. The rise of Marxism was also material. The rise of Marxism was also material, and it should not be surprising that the basic causes of its decline are also that. Well, where and on what social force did Marxism become powerful? It was, of course, the articulate ideology of the modern labor movement, and subordinate to that, the movement of the peasantry in the colonial world. Starting about 1890 and stretching all the way into the 1960s, that is the period, those 7 odd decades. It is the period of both the birth and the exponential growth of the labor movement all across the world. And the articulate ideology of that movement was, of course, Marxism. Marxism is probably second only to the organized religions of the world in the influence that it had, not just in the global north, but also in the global south. How and why did it go into decline? Well, there were 2 fundamental reasons that it went into decline. The first was that by the 1970s, the labor movement in the West, which had grown up from about the 1920s into the 60s, decade after decade, year after year, that the growth of the labor movement came to a halt. And from the 70s onward, it started to go into decline at different speeds in different parts of the world, north and south, which by and large was complete by the early 2000s. So the final quarter century of the 1900s is one of the retreat of labor after about 5 or 6 decades of the rise of labor. The labor movement had been the force that sustained and gave fuel to socialism as an ideology and Marxism as the theory of that movement and of that ideology. Once those labor movements start to go into decline, the jet fuel that had provided resources to the entire theoretical and political edifice of Marxism, that jet fuel starts to run out. The second thing that happens is what you would call the domestication of left-wing political parties. These parties had been the instrument that had translated the organizational power of unions and the working class into political legislation and political contestation. Everywhere, including India, around the world, the 1900s saw the birth of communist parties and socialist parties. These two, whether they were orthodox and hitched to international communism through the Communist International, or through orthodox communist parties, or if they were with the Socialist International and were social democratic parties, both of these parties, both of these kinds of parties, were linked to the labor movement and to socialism. The domestication of the unions, or the retreat of the unions, was coincident with and coterminous with not the collapse of these parties, they're still around, but their transformation from parties of working class struggle to parties of managing the working class. And this has been true across the world, including in India. The transformation of the CPM from party of struggle to a party of management was more or less complete by the early 2000s in West Bengal and in Kerala. The result of this was that the labor movement went from a period of 6 to 7 decades of growth to one of first retreat, then paralysis, and now more or less complete disintegration. And as that disintegration has accelerated, so the political culture in which we find ourselves has been transformed. And let me now go to what the effects, the political and ideological effects of the retreat of the labor movement are. First of all is this. In many ways, we've gone back to the 19th century. Politics in the 19th century, across the world, was a politics entirely dominated by the ruling classes, that is the asset holders in society, and the smaller property classes. If you wanted to put it in everyday language, politics was dominated by elites and the upper middle classes. This is true across Europe. It was also true in all the anti-colonial movements until the worker and peasants of colonial countries broke through and demanded that their interests also be addressed within the independence movements. If we confine our focus for a second to Europe and the United States, the 19th century was a century of elite capture of political discourse and of organized politics. What's happened since the 1980s is a reversion to that same thing. Whereas in the 19th century, the discourse of that politics was one of a kind of elite and anti-democratic liberalism. The politics in the 20th century has been one of what we call identity politics. Now, what is identity politics? It expressed the demands on the richer sections of women, ethnic minorities, those castes where there was income differentiation within lower castes, and of dominated ethnicities across the world. It was the demand on their part that having achieved some kind of economic success, they also wanted to have political and cultural respect within capitalisms across the world. Identity politics is often presented as the politics of race and ethnicity, but it's not. It never has been. It is the class politics of the richer sections of ethnicities and races and genders. Why was this politics now the dominant form in the late 20th century? It was because as labor retreated, the demands for social upliftment, the demands for social justice, came to be dominated by those forces that still had some kind of material resources for themselves. And those were the richer sections of these communities. Identity politics expressed the last gasp of the movements for social justice in the 20th century. But whereas up until the 1970s, those movements had had a working class element in them, by the 1990s and 2000s, that was gone. And what you had now was a politics of race, gender, sexuality, entirely geared towards the interests and the aspirations of the richer elements within those communities, which was palmed off as a demand for race justice, a demand for gender justice, or a demand for ethnic and caste justice. The result was that political discourse looked a lot like what it had been in the 19th century, which is that wealthier sections of the population come to dominate political discourse initially with demands that seem to be universalistic. For in the 19th century, these were demands for democracy, for rights and such things. But when push came to shove, and the demands had to be operationalized, in the 19th century, when liberals and liberal parties said they wanted the franchise to be extended, they wanted voting rights, they wanted economic and political rights, it turned out it was only for people who had property. It was only for people who had the education. In other words, it was for the deserving sections of society. And your deservingness was proven by your holding of property and by your payment of certain levels of taxation. In the 20th century, the deservingness came from virtue and what's called virtue signaling. That you had the education, you had the means, you were in the labor market, but you were not being given the same rewards and the same respect that other people of your class who are from the dominant community, the dominant gender, or the dominant race were getting. What both had in common was at first, and in the 19th century, an open contempt for the poor. In the 20th century, at first a hidden contempt for the poor, and by now, identity politics is openly contemptuous of poor people. It calls it class reductionism, economic determinism. These are all code words for saying we don't want to hear about poverty. We don't want to hear about the poor, because we all know all that is something 19th century white males used to talk about. So oddly enough, demands of the poor are now summarily dismissed as a kind of conservative 19th century politics. What's the result of that? Once politics and demands for redistribution come to be dominated by ethnic, racial, and gendered communities, the 20th century politics of universal justice, of universal advance, of universal claims upon the national product is transformed into a tribal warfare. The tribes in this case are various forms of communities, political communities, like gender, race, ethnicity, etc. But each community is subordinated to the interests and the demands of the richest elements within it. It is a tribal warfare of the wealthy mobilizing various kinds of identities in support of their battles within what is frankly an oligarchy now across the world. So where we are today, in the wake of the retreat of the labor movement on the left, is a politics of tribal warfare within the South and within the global North, all in the name of social justice. It's a kind of barbarism, because it is a political culture entirely hegemonized by the top 20% of the population, turning around and kicking in the teeth the rest of the 80% of the population. It's a barbarism of a special kind, though. In the early 20th century, Rosa Luxemburg and the leaders of the Second International had raised the specter in the 19 teens that the choice between the working class and of European populations in general was between socialism and barbarism. Why? Because in defense of property, in defense of the Ancien regime, ruling classes at the time were unleashing such waves of violence, such waves of terror, that the choice politically at the moment for most of the population was between the programs being offered by the left and accepting this kind of naked repression on the part of the state. That was a barbarism that came from the failure of the socialist revolution. It was a counter-revolutionary barbarism. Where we are today is a barbarism of a very different kind. It is not one that's come out of the smashing of the left. It's one that's come from the gradual retreat of the left and the very rapid hegemony of the political sphere by the professional and the property classes, in which, because this is a capitalism that's been a slow-growing capitalism for about 30 years now, the mad scramble for income and wealth, that mad scramble within the top 20% has bared its fangs toward the rest of the majority of the population, in which they are not afraid to use various forms of repression, various forms of intimidation, of the silencing of speech, of the open mobilization of xenophobia and racism. All of this appears to be cultural, but it's not. It is the expression of the, what one might say, euphoria of the wealthy to be finally rid of the political weight of laboring classes in the political culture. This is the barbarism that we confront now. And it is one in which there's absolutely no scope for the vast majority of the world's population, even though the rhetoric of this culture is one of justice, rights, equality, etc. It is justice for the rich, equality among the rich, and multiculturalism for the rich. What we have now is a multicultural political and ruling class presiding over a multicultural and multiracial working class globally. That's the choice we now face. Accepting the political culture that the elites have foisted upon the rest of the population,
or recovering what is valuable and what enabled the enormous social advances of the 20th century. And that recovery is going to involve, ironically, not just the Marxist tradition, but also bringing liberalism back to its more civilized form, the form that it took between, say, the 19-teens and the 1960s. The two, I'm going to say now, rise and fall together. Now, why is that? Liberalism today is once again the ideology of the professional and the property classes. But for the better part of the 20th century, it had also made room for the working classes. Why was that? It was because as the 19th century progressed and the labor movement was born, liberalism was caught with a dilemma. Its rhetoric was one of universal rights, of universal interests, of universal freedoms. This was a rhetoric that had been birthed by the Enlightenment, by Rousseau, by Kant, by ultimately Marx himself. But that rhetoric was at odds with the political ambitions of liberal parties, because those parties were utterly dominated by the property classes. So while there was a very egalitarian and very radical rhetoric that liberal philosophy generated, the political pursuits of liberal parties were confined to the aspirations and the interests of the wealthy. The choice that liberals faced then was whether they would pursue their philosophy and their egalitarian ideology, or whether they would pursue the concrete political ambitions of liberal parties. Liberal politicians made the choice very clearly. They went with the latter, with the liberal parties and their very narrow conception of politics and the political universe. What forced liberalism towards more egalitarian perspective was the birth of the labor movement itself. The labor movement ended up not just creating the modern socialist parties, the ideology of socialism, and then, of course, the theory of Marxism. The labor movement also civilized liberalism. The birth of progressive and egalitarian liberalism can be traced back to the 1880s and 90s across Europe, all of which was in response to the demands of labor. The labor movement split liberals between one section that was committed to the traditional goals of liberal politics, which was a defense of property and a highly restricted franchise, and a smaller section that came towards more egalitarian perspective on politics, more in line with the egalitarian ethos of liberal philosophy. As the labor movement grew in its substance, in its power, so liberalism continued its march towards an egalitarian progressivism rather than the exclusionary forms of the 19th century. Now, this progressivism was never anti-capitalist. It sought to find ways of marrying egalitarianism to capitalism, and that's why there's a large liberal justification for and defense of the welfare state. The welfare state was fought for by the working classes, but its theorization, the actual models, the actual policy proposals, in many instances came from non-socialist liberal intellectuals who saw the virtue of the demands that were being made and who gleaned that these demands were actually the fulfillment of the dream of liberal philosophical and moral concerns. Across the 20th century, therefore, you see liberalism becoming a much, much more finely tuned ideology harnessed to the interests of the general population rather than just the property classes. On the Marxist and socialist side, there was also a consilience. Now we're talking about outside the Soviet bloc. But inside Western Europe, where there were socialist parties, inside the United States, there was a strong element of the socialist movement that also had to take into account the contributions that liberalism was making and find ways of accommodating to the political and philosophical ambitions of liberal culture. Why was that? The reason was, everywhere where the socialist parties were gaining traction, were getting an anchor in the working class, they came to realize that the working class never comprised more than about half or 60% of the population. Right up until 1940s, you must keep in mind, in France, in Germany, Scandinavia, everywhere except England in Europe, the agrarian sector still accounted for anywhere from 25 to 35% of the labor force. Outside of agriculture, there was a vast ocean of shopkeepers and professionals, which were deeply embedded inside the political culture. If you wanted to have a successful electoral mobilization for social democracy, you of course had to organize labor, but you would also have to win over sections of professional classes and the farmers, which in India we would call sections of the peasantry. The only way you could do that was by coming up with a program that, first of all, married their interests to the interests of the working class, and secondly, opening up your ideology that recognized the positive contributions of liberalism as a philosophy. The orthodox communist states, under the banner of Leninism, had an open contempt for liberal democracy, liberalism. You could afford to do that because you had state power. This was not possible in Western Europe and in the rest of the world, where middle classes had to be brought voluntarily to the movement of the working class. So you not only had to come up with a political program that recognized their interests, but also an ideological penumbra, an ideological stance that saw the importance of liberal rights, liberal achievements. This wasn't hard because all those liberal rights had been fought for by the working class. What we today call liberal democracy, bourgeois democracy, was entirely a working class achievement. It was not, therefore, inconceivable for the non-Leninist, the non-Orthodox left, to find an accommodation, some kind of meeting of the minds with liberalism. That was the story of the 20th century, where both of these currents came together. Within socialism, within social democracy, this reached its zenith with Nordic, British, French social democracy and the socialist parties at the time, which saw something of real value in liberalism. In liberalism, it reached its zenith in the egalitarian social democratic programs of the 1960s, which represented the zenith of social democracy across the world. And philosophically, in the work of people like John Rawls, who in his theory of justice laid out a vision of society and social justice, which is profoundly egalitarian. Implicit in a theory of justice, which was published in 1970, was a model of society where property rights were secondary to the social and economic rights of people. Towards the end of his life, when Rawls published his book, Justice is Fairness, he explicitly says, it's very unlikely that what I and what liberalism take to be a functional and defensible model of justice is compatible with capitalism. Towards the end of his life, Rawls quite explicitly advocated for some kind of socialism as a fulfillment of the promise of liberal rights. Now, this was a kind of universalism. It was a kind of egalitarianism that was inconceivable if propounded by a liberal in the 19th century. The reason Rawls comes to this position is that he allows himself to be educated by all the gains and all the demands of the labor movement across the 20th century. Both of these movements, therefore, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I would suggest, not insist, but suggest, they come together, at least theoretically and institutionally in the 1960s and 70s, as the culmination of many parts of the Enlightenment tradition. A respect for humanity, a cosmopolitanism, a fundamentally egalitarian ethos, and a firm belief that reason and rationality can be put to the service of human progress. Not the progress of Europeans, not the progress of this or that ethnicity, but human progress. This is what we lost. What we lost now is, and oddly, under the guise of radicalism, It's radicals today who denigrate universalism. It's radicals who denigrate the search for equality. It's radicals who denigrate cosmopolitanism. Why? It has to do with the intellectual degeneration that accompanied the political degeneration of the neoliberal era. What we call post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, all this nonsense, it is the philosophical and theoretical expression of the degraded culture of neoliberalism. And it is no surprise that it has been propagated in the most elite universities, in the most elite institutions of education in the North and the South. It is no surprise that it finds an anchor among dominant castes. It should be only a matter of time before the BJP takes a hold of this. Because to propound the cultural and ethnic essentialism of post-colonial theory, it's ready-made for the far right. It was made in heaven for them. It's a surprise that they haven't gotten more aggressively involved in it. It is starting, one is seeing it around the world. They just have to attract more people who can read and write. Once they get intellectuals who can actually read and discuss text, you'll see it a lot more. Well, that's the world that we've lost, and it's the world that we're in. What are the chances of a movement back to that ethos? First of all, do we want it? To me, it's the only way out of the morass that we're in. What we are in right now is in a historically unprecedented era. We are in an era where the formal institutions of democracy are fairly secure, unlike the 19th century, where democracy was still the plaything of the wealthy. The institutions of democracy are actually quite secure, but they've been degraded to the point where people are either unable to use them or too intimidated to try to use them. They've either been entirely captured by the wealthy, or they've been degraded to the point where they lack the capacity to be effective. And there is no social force right now in any part of the modern world that is capable of revitalizing them. And the reason for that is simple. Once you push working people out of the political arena, nobody has either the interest or the capacity to bring the ethos of a universalistic egalitarian democracy back into the political cultures. What you get instead is everybody scrambling for their tiny piece of the pie, using whatever tribal affiliations they have to mobilize those beneath them. It is a kind of, as I said, oligarchic warfare. This barbarism, it will destroy the world. It will, whether through environmental collapse or through the skyrocketing levels of poverty, hunger, the rage that is flaring through the world among the poor right now, of being rejected, of being denigrated, of being spit upon, even as they're being ground under the feet of a global capitalism. That rage will destroy the world unless we figure out a way of restoring to them their humanity, of restoring to them some kind of agency in the political sphere so that they can find dignity, they can find self-respect in not just their private spheres, but in the public sphere. There's no other option. So in the 21st century, it is not simply a question of can Marxism recover? It is a question of can bourgeois society recover? And it took the rise of the labor movement to civilize bourgeois society 100 years ago. It will, I would submit, take the similar rise, a resuscitation of the labor movement to restore some kind of decency to capitalism once again. So, for the 21st century, if there's an agenda of stepping back from the brink of barbarism, the first step has to be a single-minded dedication to restoring the power and the agency of labor. Nothing else matters. I have not seen any credible argument for any other road to revitalizing the promise of democracy as we saw it in the 20th century. The first thing you need, therefore, is a revitalization of the labor movement. The second thing is going to be some kind of political program that harnesses other sections of the population to the labor movement. Now, it's important to realize, by these other sections, what I mean is basically middle classes, professional classes, and such. This was the recipe in the 19th, early 20th centuries. It has to be one also today, for the simple reason that even today, while the working class in advanced capitalism comprises about 60 to 65% of the population, the middle class is comprised another 20 to 25%. You cannot leave them out of any viable movement. And the same is true in India, where the working class, if you count the formal and informal sector, and agrarian labor is probably around 70% of the population. But if you take the shopkeeper class, the professionals, and middle peasants, you have another 25%. There is no 21st century left-wing politics that leaves out the middle class. So you have to harness both of these as you did in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, how are you going to do that? It's going to be through a political program that expresses the needs and the interests of both of these. And it's going to have to be through a theory that helps us understand how the modern world works. While the program comes out of the socialist movement, the theory is going to be something like the Marxism of the 20th century. Because until something else replaces it as a more illuminating, as a more viable account of how capitalism actually works, until that happens, Marxism is still the best thing that we have. The political task is of rebuilding the labor movement, of bringing up a program that wins over sections of the middle classes enough to make it a viable social movement. The theoretical task is to build on all the achievements of Marxist theory, which started to go into decline in the 1980s, see where the pinnacle, the most advanced sections, where it had its deepest insights, and then try to build on top of those insights like any viable research program does in the scientific community. This will be, in my mind, the face of 21st century progressivism. It looks a lot like the 19th and 20th century progressivism. But there's one key component of it. It does not work if the middle classes set the terms of the alliance. So if you want to be pretentious, this is what Gramsci called hegemony. Lenin called it hegemony, and Gramsci got it from him. The key question for the 21st century is not just which classes will come together. We're already seeing a kind of tacit recognition on the part of what's called the democratic socialists in Europe and in the United States, that you need to bring in what's called the professional classes. The question is, who's going to set the terms of the alliance? In the United States right now, the Democratic Party is a party whose ideological articulate vision comes from these middle classes. And it is the ideology of tribalism. And they have an open contempt for working people. Maybe in conversation we can talk about this. That the reaction of the Democratic Party to Zoran Mamdani's candidacy is the reaction of the professional classes and their corporate masters to that candidacy. Now, the interesting thing is Mamdani also is drawing on one section of the professional classes himself. This is the growing divergence within the middle class on the question of socialism. And for those 5 or 6 of us who are still Marxists, the analytical task is to come up with a materialist analysis of whether that cleavage is purely ideological or if it's rooted in the different life experiences and the different material conditions of these different strata within the middle class. If the ideological and articulate elements of the middle class are allowed to set the agenda, in other words, to become hegemonic, the movement fails. Because they articulate their interests in such a way that it's deeply repellent to most working people. But that does not mean we, as some parts of the left are saying, we deem the professional classes an enemy. You cannot, because there are too many of them. And they're not exploiters. Many of them are just very high-skilled workers or middle class. You cannot deem them irrelevant. This is also true in India. What you have to figure out is a way of setting an agenda that is driven by the vision and the interests of workers and peasants, but is also attractive to the professional classes. That's going to come through some kind of egalitarianism. In the short run, some kind of social democratic agenda, north and south, which recognizes the material insecurities of many sections of the middle class, and therefore harnesses them to the broader egalitarian agenda of the working class. The two indispensable components of this are exactly what the radical theorists of today denigrate. First of all, a recognition that interests are real, they're objective, and they are the foundation of left-wing politics. It's not discourse, it's not values, it's not identity. It's interests, and you shape an identity around those interests. Secondly, a deep and abiding commitment to universalism. First of all, recognizing the universal power and depredations of capital. The capital, wherever it goes, is just capital, whether it's in black skin, brown skin, or white skin, whether it's Christian, Muslim, or Hindu. It's capital. And its properties are universalistic. And against that, the universal aspirations and needs of those people who capital is grinding under its feet, working people and sections of the middle class, recognizing that their interests are not only material, they're also universal. And just as capital sees no borders, so labor has to figure out how to overcome its differences across borders. If the labor movement subordinates itself to its ethnic, national, and caste identities, it dies. The only way out of that is through going back to the best of the liberal socialist combination of the 20th century, which saw the progress of humanity through science, through universalism, through reason, and through the bringing together of a political program around those universal human needs. Now, can we do that? I have no idea. Right now, things are looking the worst they've looked in 300 years. There are very few sections of the articulate middle classes who are actually committed to revitalizing this agenda, because the middle classes are scrambling for the crumbs that they can get themselves. But I do know this: if we don't revitalize it, I do not think humanity has a chance. It'll either succumb to the ongoing, unfolding environmental disaster, or through this intensifying, explosive combination of oligarchic tribalism and the enraged fire, the anger of the laboring classes. I'll leave you on that happy note.
Thank you, Professor Chibber, for an enlightening lecture. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, clarifications, and comments. So we open the floor for Q&A. I see plenty of hands there. So we'll take 3 questions at a time. No, we'll take 3 questions at a time. Yeah. So begin by introducing yourself, and please keep your questions short and crisp.
Why don't you can decide who's asking the question. Yeah.
Hi, I am Shubhajit. I'm doing a PhD in Development Studies in Delhi only. My question is, what did the previous left movement, when it was on the upsurge, offer to the middle classes and the professionals, which we can have something to take from when we are looking at alliance building today? Whether there is a parallel today, whether we can offer something from which was offered back then, or something new has to be offered, so that the terms are also ours, but also they come to our fold. That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chibber, for such a compelling session. So basically, my question is kind of curiosity. Basically, the criticism regarding identity politics, which argue that it is mostly driven by the few agenda of few elites. I mean, basically, well-off people. So, but isn't this argument is inherently contradictory itself? Because it expects the marginals, I mean, poor, to be at the forefront, mobilize and assert, but in reality they lacks the vocabulary or even the resources to mobilize. And there is one more related question. Sorry. So the second is basically the way forward is like you suggested, revitalizations of labor movement and incorporation of the middle class, basically for the social movement. So basically, I mean, isn't it more of a general argument that basically ignores the practical reality, especially in the current world where we have seen that peoples are very polarized. They are very specific to their identities, and they assert their differences like that. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. I'm a economics PhD student here. It's a very provocative lecture, but I'm a little confused about this term middle class. Firstly, a clarificatory question: who are the middle classes? Are they professionals? In the way, say, for example, the managers of a corporation, the CEOs, etc., or are we talking about petty producers, the people who are sitting in the kabadi walas, the ones on the vendors, street vendors, etc. Because these are two different classes. One of them are actually exploited, the others are hangers on to surplus value. So, how do we then recognize this contradiction? If you want to bring...
I understand.
Yeah.
No, just 3 questions, because it's actually 4 questions. One point, just when you ask your questions, just ask one question. Okay? It's not 3 people, it's 3 questions.
Yeah. Not 3 questions per person, 1 question per person.
They're all very good questions, and they all, I think, orbit around the same issue. All 3 questions have to do primarily with the middle class, although there is also an addendum with regard to working people and how they relate to these issues. So I'm just going to try to systematically answer all 3 instead of taking them seriatim. So first of all, what do we mean by the middle class? I use it in a Marxian sense, not in an income-based sense. So a middle-class person is technically somebody who's neither an exploiter nor exploited. Neither somebody who's extracting surplus from somebody else, nor somebody who's producing a surplus for an employer. So those tend to be people who are the typical example, or the best example of middle class is what we call an owner-operator. Somebody who owns their own means of production and then works it with their own labor. So a shopkeeper who's using family labor, a rediwala who owns his own redi, who owns his own means of production would be another one. And then we also include members of the professional classes. Those members of the professional classes who have a degree of autonomy from the employer, who might manage their own operations, and many of them are managers. Now the question of manager is a little bit complicated because there are gradations within managers. So if you look at upper level management, it's probably not accurate to call them middle class because they have many of the powers of capital, the powers of employers, right? They can hire and fire, they take part in investment decisions, they make decisions about organizing and reorganizing the labor process. So the upper echelons of management, I'm not talking about CEOs. CEOs are obviously bourgeois. But upper level management should be considered some kind of offshoot of capital. Whereas if you look at supervisors and lower level management, those are mostly glorified workers. So it's going to be an empirical question as to who we're talking about. Globally, overall, what we're saying is owner-operators plus, sorry to use this, it's kind of tautological, but I'll say it, middle rungs of the managerial class. I'm using the word middle to define middle, which is not cool, but nobody's really listening anyway. So that's what we mean by the middle class. That also includes, now technically that does not include things like software engineers, programmers, those are highly skilled workers. Colloquially, we often talk about them as middle class because their income is quite high. Now, if we use, whichever way we're using middle class, it comes to your question, not the first question, about programs. Many of the sections of these middle class people are, even though they own their own means of production or they're very highly skilled, in today's capitalism, they're facing 2 or 3 similar economic problems. One is that if you are in a capitalism like the American one, and increasingly the British one, you cannot access some of the basic goods that are necessary for a stable life. Whether it's healthcare, in the US, transportation, there's no public transportation. Energy, retirement. A viable social democratic left-wing program if it offers to what we call decommodify, that is to provide these services for free as a citizenship right, right now that's going to win over many sections of the middle class to you, even though they might be batshit crazy identitarians. It's going to win them over to you because at the end of the day, they need these things. That's why you see a lot of younger professionals going to Zoran. The reason is, unlike the older professionals who at this stages of their career have pensions, have medical, have various kinds of other amenities, younger people entering the professions are not seeing the same future for themselves. And that future is a long way away. In the United States, there's no public housing. Not only do they not have healthcare, transportation, etc., they also can't find houses. They can't own property. And it's very hard because your rents are so high in larger cities where these kids live. They're burning away most of their paychecks on rent. So they're coming to someone like Mamdani on very clear material concerns. And this was also true in mid-century. Sections of the highly skilled workers and professional classes came to social democracy because they were offered some respite from the crushing weight of the market. Now, we're just talking about some very basic demands of centrist social democracy right now. And the world is so bad, you can win over sections of the middle class to it right now. As your demands, as your ambitions widen in scope, and you try to transform bourgeois society in a more and more progressive direction, that challenge is going to be different. You'll have to figure out new ways of keeping them on board. Right now, this is the easy phase. Right now, what Mamdani and Bernie Sanders are offering, it's not socialism. This is the kind of policies that centrist Republicans and centrist Tories and conservatives were offering in the 1950s and 60s. It only looks progressive because we are in the midst of barbarism. There's nothing radical about this stuff. So this is the easy phase, and you can certainly do this now. Which brings us to the next question. You asked two questions. Is it practically realizable given how polarized society is? Society is polarized because people are fighting over scraps. People aren't born fanatics. People aren't born racists. They're not born Hindu chauvinists. They're fighting over scraps, and they find these identities the best means to struggle for those scraps because they can create a viable political coalition based around them. My view is, and it's based on history, we've seen tribal warfare before. That was what the 19th century was. It was much worse because it ended up with World War I. If you give these people a reason to hope and something that gives them dignity and a decent life, yeah, I think you have a fighting chance to go beyond those polarized identities. It's not going to be automatic. But if you are committed to it, there's no other way. Because you have to find a common ground that would bring these people together. Your first question was, well, am I contradicting myself with regard to identity politics when I say, and you correctly pointed out, I say that identity politics is really politics of the rich. But then, isn't it contradictory then to imply that the poor need to take it over when the poor have no capacity? It's not contradictory. It's just a challenge. It's happened before. In both Europe and in the United States, struggles for racial justice and gender justice were not always dominated by the rich. This was a phenomenon of the 80s onward. The American Civil Rights Movement was a social democratic movement. And the reason for that is the most mobilized elements in that movement were trade unions led by black trade union organizers. That was an actual movement for racial justice. What we have now is a movement for racial advancement of the rich. Not super rich, but rich. So it's not contradictory. It is, however, a challenge. And the solution to all of these things is the same. And yeah, that makes me an essentialist. You do all of this through the labor movement. There's no other solution.
As we talk about Marxist universalism, so I have a question regarding institutions. So, what institution could realize Marxist universality or universalism without reproducing bureaucratic authoritarianism or neoliberal cooptation?
To me, is I don't know about the rest of you.
The last part, you said the socialist liberal agenda, particularly the universal egalitarian aspect of liberalism, drawing a section of middle class that can be affected. The challenge is before that you described the labor movement stagnated, paralyzed, and then disintegrated. So from a perspective of say egalitarianism, even labor movement can be seen as the receiving end of a process. Or there can be an idea of class power, class action, class initiative. At the present situation, when the movement, particularly the strength of working class or labor is so disintegrated, any alliance actually can be led, even in terms of universalism, by the left wing of liberals. So when we try to combine it, whether we are doing it at the cost of developing class power, because class power is not an essential part of liberalism despite universalism.
One more.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Vikash. I'm doing PhD from Sociology here. My question is, on your suggestion that middle classes and the working classes need to come together to develop a program, on whose terms? That was the big question. Now, one of the important wedges that draw a distinction between these two sections is the idea of merit and the common sense of merit that determines the aspirations of the middle class. Now, and this is both the meritocratic common sense and the common sense of merit as an entity. So my question is, when we draw a common, it's a cliche term, or common minimum program, but if we draw a common program, the discourse of dignity matters more than merit. So how do we bring that up so that, merit and the this is what I'm trying to ask: how dignity vis-a-vis merit works to develop that common minimum understanding of politics together. Thank you.
These are all superb questions, really. They're excellent. I'm going to have to change my opinion about PhD students. Ruchi, I honestly don't have a good answer to your question as to which institutions would not be co-opted. Let me put it this way. I think we move forward with a very heightened consciousness of the fact that they were co-opted in the past. And as we're moving forward, we try to study the facts about the parties or the organizations or the state institutions which made them vulnerable to co-optation. And we do, this sounds terrible, it sounds like a cop-out, but literally there's no other answer at this stage. And anyone else who tells you that they have an answer is lying. We just do the best we can. The reason I'm saying this is that I don't know of any. Here's what the typical left answer is: we democratize. Well, okay. That and a few rupees will get you a cup of coffee. I don't know if that's true, actually. That and a lot of rupees will get you a cup of coffee. Democratize is a cop-out because it's such a vague, abstract term. A proper answer to your question demands not just a vague invocation of democracy, but a specification of the rules and the organizational and institutional forms that would do two things. Make the organization and the institutions genuinely open to discussion and deliberation, but also not paralyze them. What the 21st century left's understanding of democracy is everybody has to agree on everything. And what you get is the absolute destruction of organizations, or their takeover by people who are so insane that they think a 10-hour meeting is what democracy looks like. So you have to figure out how to marry the inclusion of people and their incorporation, but then also the viability of the institutions. And I don't think we have a good solution to that right now, because over the past 30 years, what we've seen is the decline of these institutions. Okay, that being the case, let me just say this. I will take co-opted and degenerate institutions of 1960s social democracy over what we have now. So my feeling is, get working, win some gains, figure out how to get people back up on their feet, and then, in a very alert and open way, see how you can effectively marry these two ambitions of institutions that actually represent the broader society, which, however, are not captured by the most neurotic person who says, we're not leading this room until everybody agrees with me. Right? I don't think we have any better answer than that right now, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you. On the second question, it's an excellent question, which is that, let me restate it and you tell me if I've expressed it correctly. I think what you're saying is that right now, the facts are that while we can hope and wish for labor's hegemony over this, what Leonard called a smichka, this alliance between laboring and working class, middle classes, effectively right now, because of the decimation of labor institutions, it's the left wing of the middle class that's going to hegemonize. And because it's that section that's hegemonizing, you face a problem, which is that they don't have an instinctive regard for labor and the importance of labor. So how do we get beyond that? I think it's a very good point, because what you didn't say, but I think is consistent with what you're saying, is that if the left wing of the middle class hegemonizes, it probably won't do what needs to be done to revitalize labor. And you'll be stuck in this little cul-de-sac, this dead end, right? I think that's true. I think from what I have seen empirically, it all comes down to what you mean by left wing. So there is a self-styled left wing of the middle class that hates working people. They call themselves left because they're intersectional, and they're always about finding the most marginal, finding the most obscure, and then fighting over that. I suspect most of JNU is like that. It's okay, you follow what the Americans do. So whatever starts over there eventually comes over here. But there is a very strong, growing section of left-wing liberals who are in the mold of the Sanders and the Corbyns of the world. And they are now increasingly, they're all your age, and they are increasingly entering the ranks of labor, of socialist parties. I didn't see this 10 years ago. 10 years ago, left liberals were crazy tribal warriors. They still exist in the majority probably today, but they're not as powerful as they used to be. So it comes down to this. Who's going to win? Because you're right. The reason I give these talks to middle-class people, there's something bizarre about going to middle-class institutions and talking about revitalizing labor. Why on earth do I do it? Well, one reason is nobody in labor invites me. Because they don't want to hear this stuff. But here's the other reason. In the 19th century, when labor movements took off, the triggering of the organizing came from a marriage between articulate, well-read sections of these highly skilled working classes and intellectuals. Intellectuals, not in like PhD types, but people who read for a living and journalists and things like that. There is a place for left liberals and intellectuals in revitalizing labor. We've seen it in the past, and it's been true throughout. So it comes down to who wins. And I think it's less unrealistic today to imagine a marriage between these two social forces, labor organizers and not crazy left-wing liberals, than it was 10 years ago. You're absolutely right. If they inhabit the moral universe
of the professional classes as we've seen it in the last 20 years, there's no hope. I'm not as pessimistic as I used to be about that. I hope that answers your question. The final question then is, well, what about the role of merit? The middle classes are very wedded to this idea of merit. And for laboring classes, it's dignity that's the most important. And dignity presumably means having access to certain rights, certain privileges, certain stations as a social right, rather than based on your deservingness as measured by education and skill and such things. So if we're committed to dignity in that sense, won't it end up alienating the middle class? Am I right? Do I understand you correctly?
Yeah, I mean, that is how the program has to work.
Yeah.
The center of that would be dignity.
I think I do not believe there's a real tension between these things. I think it's become a tension because of the way in which propertied minorities and professional minorities and women asserted a right to certain positions simply on the basis of their identity and turned it into a general program of social advancement, which I think repelled a lot of people, not just workers, but other members of the middle class as well. On the other hand, I believe most people in society, worker or non-worker, they believe in merit for the following reason. Many of you are going to have an operation at some point. You want to know your doctor actually has the skills. You want to know your pilots can fly the planes. You want to know that the people who are making your medicines actually know what they're doing. I don't think working people say, no, screw all that, I just want that job. What they want is a sense that they have a fair shot. That's the essence of merit for most people. They also want the fact that the basic necessities of life should not have to be fought for. So dignity, I don't think, extends to making a claim on every office in society simply as a social right. I think what dignity means is, I don't want to be bossed around. I don't want to have to beg for scraps. And I should have the essential means to lead a decent life for myself so that I don't demean myself asking somebody else for those scraps. I do not think they interpret dignity to mean the absence of merit. So one way to put this is, I think a more egalitarian socialistic society puts merit exactly where it belongs because it gives working people a fair shot at getting the more skilled positions, getting the college education, getting the more coveted status in life. I think that's all they want. And I don't therefore see a tension between those things. And the good news is I think most middle class people agree with that. I think when they say merit, what they mean is everybody should have a fair shot. That's called equality of opportunity. I think socialism will deliver an actual equality of opportunity as opposed to simply formal equality of rights.
Please raise your hands. I can't see any hands there. Yeah, right at the back.
You can try.
It's a very, very long room.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful lecture. So my question basically follows the same line of thought as was followed in the other questions which preceded my question, which is basically, for example, take a case in which you have, you basically, panacea is that we will, finally, the conclusion would be in form of a language which deals with two things, which is the universality and the idea of interest. Now what happens in a case in which you have a historical accumulation of surplus which happens in a particular culture or in a particular identity which is not material, say caste. Now, how do you develop a new language to basically make sure that these two forms of signifiers are completely disentangled, the cultural and the interest, which apparently empirically they are not. Apparently empirically you have an accumulation in the overlap of both of these, culture as well as material. So how do you make sure that these two are disentangled in your vision of what you call the international communist, the revival of international communist political program? Thank you.
My
question is similar to his actually. When we see in India, capital is organized around caste, right? Like the accumulation has, there are social and cultural mechanisms that determine economic outcomes. It was also ambiguous to me, your reference to identity politics. If that is taken to mean social justice, should liberation based on class struggle necessarily be class-based mobilization? Why not social justice? In not only in India, in several parts where what he's talking about is also that the other cycle that goes on, emancipation through social and cultural modes to determine economic justice. Is what I was saying.
Hello, Sir Chibber. Thank you very much for your good lecture. Obviously, I came to listen to you. I was listening to you very close, and I heard that you referred to tribal warfare, quote unquote, many times, which in India does not make sense because tribe here is actually a constitutionally. Some tribes are declared like special, vulnerable, protected, and so on. So tribal warfare is a problem here in India, but what do you mean when you say tribal warfare? Is it a stereotype, or do you want to undermine the popular resistance among tribals because you were talking about humanization, humanity. Tribals, after all, from an anthropological perspective, remain human. Thank you.
Let me start with the last question. I said several times I'm using it as a metaphor. So you say you were listening carefully. I'm not sure that's true. I don't know what more to say. Of course I recognize the humanity. I mean, this is just ridiculous. So let me just move on to the other questions. I think both of the first two questions, I would be careful about saying that caste is not based on material things. I don't think caste is a cultural phenomenon. I think it's fundamentally based on material deprivation and on people trying to utilize their kinship networks and their caste networks as a way of seeking security within a very insecure world. This is in the urban areas and even in the rural areas. And in addition to that, in the rural areas, caste networks are a way of securing and maintaining power. This has been known since M.N. Srinivas. This has been known for 60 years now. The only person who ever said caste is cultural is a whack job from France named Louis Dumont, who, honest to goodness, I don't know why he was ever taken seriously. It's the most orientalist and exoticized view of caste ever written. It has no merit to it whatsoever. Caste endures in India because of the role it plays in the material reproduction on both sides of the class divide. And caste discrimination is also to be found within the working class. But it's there not for cultural reasons or false consciousness. It's there because, especially within the working class, caste networks are an absolutely indispensable means of securing a livelihood and of securing access to material resources. Now, if that's true, then the premise of your question kind of dissolves. Because it's no longer an issue of disentangling the cultural and the material. It is a question of addressing the material in a very specific way. It's a question now of in a sense, liberating people from their attachment to their caste networks by giving them access to jobs, security, a social wage, and social rights, to housing, to medical care, etc., so that those networks play a less salient role in their everyday lives. And if the networks play a less salient role in their everyday lives, those identities become less explosive in their lives, become less salient for them in their lives. It is, I mean, I don't know if you're being taught this in your sociology courses, but if you are, you should demand your money back. You pay in JNU? I don't know, what goes on? Do you have to pay for your education? Okay, well, whatever little money you pay, you should ask for it back. Now, the issue of capital being organized around caste, I don't see that as being relevant, because all capitalist classes are essentially castes. They don't call themselves castes in the West, but they're very exclusive. Their kids have zero merit in their lives, but they get all the goods. They're incredibly exclusivist and racist. And there's lots of sociological studies of this. They organize themselves around their agnatic and kin networks and with a fanatical zeal. So there is a tendency in India to see India as being unique and exclusive. It's not just the current government that thinks that way, it's also the left. And it exoticizes Indian reality in a way that's not very productive. You don't have to deny the reality of caste. It's ubiquitous. You do, however, have to stop thinking that there's something unique about the Indian mindset. If you want to think that, 19th century James Mill is a perfectly good person to think, or John Stuart Mill, or Baden Powell, you can just go read them. Indians are just like everyone else. If they have enduring social institutions, especially ones that are organized around hierarchies like caste, they're all based on material issues, all of them. Your task as growing social scientists, as inquisitive, progressively minded people, is to recognize that Indians are motivated by the same things that Westerners are. It takes a different institutional form and finds different organizational anchors. The analytical task is to see how it is you go from similar motivations to quite dissimilar institutions. You're not going to do it by taking the easy way and saying, well, it's because we are different. Indians are no different from anyone else. So, in my mind, the fact that capital is organized around caste doesn't mean anything. It's always organized around very closely tight-knit identities. Capital reproduces itself through profit-seeking activities. And because of that, it has the same interests if it's organized inside a caste or if it's organized inside a Christian brotherhood. Capital is capital for that reason. So I don't think the empirical fact about caste organizations within Indian capitalists changes anything of any substance in our analysis.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Vidisha. I'm a master's student from Center for Political Studies. So my question is, in global South countries like India, the middle class, the Indian middle class, has a tendency to align with the right-wing forces and neoliberal development. So how does classical Marxism explain this reactionary politics of the middle class? Shouldn't Marxism, shouldn't it interrogate it more, considering the pre-colonial structures like caste and kinship, rather than just explaining it as a false consciousness or hegemony from the above?
I saw a couple of hands from there.
Hello, Professor. Myself Vikas. I am master student in CPS. So my question is with regard to contrast between post-colonial theory and classical Marxism. Basically, in post-colonial theory, ये बोला जाता है कि there is so many diversity, और जो पिछला मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन है उसका भी एक रिमेनेंस इंडिया में एग्जिस्ट करता है. बट इन यूरोप मतलब कि एक तरीके से एक सक्सेशंस दिखता है एक मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन से दूसरे मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन. बट व्हाट माय रीडिंग in post-colonial theory most of, but what my reading suggests that कि in Europe there is मतलब capitalist system में भी अभी के समय में भी there is remnants of the previous mode of the production. So how this dichotomy between these is, and to what extent the post-colonial theory is able to argue in this way.
Hello, sir. My question, I'm a PhD student, CAS, JNU. So my question is particularly about American politics. If we say that there is a distinction in understanding of left in India and USA, like they make a parallel between the left and the socialist and the communist, and the way we see here center, they see there the left. You have mentioned about Joran. I'm saying like the way we see here left. Like if you're on the side of the right ideology or the left ideology, you have to have some sort of socialist welfare schemes to go with. But in USA, you don't have to do that. Like if you even talk about welfare schemes, you talk about certain basic things, they'll call you lefty. They'll call you in USA. So there is a difference in understanding of the left, particularly the left ideology in USA and in India. As you mentioned about Joran Mamdani's win in New York City, like the mayoral post, he won in the primary of the Democrats, and he will soon become the governor. But it's a blue mayor, because it's a blue state. But I'm saying like, will it happen in 2028 all over America? Like the question is, Kamala Harris lost election 2024. There are two views. The one is that she was too left, or there was another view that she was too right, like she was going with Liz Cheney, and she was not speaking about progressive policies enough. So what do you think so? Like, is it America, like, what should the Democrats do? They should go more left, or they should go more towards right? That's what my question is. Thank you.
The first question, I feel like you're repeating things you've heard rather than simply asking me a question. Because it was a jumble of many different sorts of things. Your basic question is, why in India the middle class is very reactionary? How would Marxism explain that? I don't think there's any mystery to Marxism, why they're reactionary. It's because most middle classes are reactionary in settings where you have enormous surplus labor. Middle classes have an instinctive contempt for labor because they routinely come across the poor in conditions of authority over them, as their washers, as their thobiwalas, as their dishwashers, as their mais. So it's not at all surprising that in a country like that, one of the things that distinguishes a European middle class person growing up, an Indian middle class person. Every European or American working class person does some wage labor at some point in their life. That has a profound effect on their consciousness. Nobody in the Indian middle class, the educated Indian middle class, does wage labor. If they do, they hide it. Now, that's going to have an enormous effect on your consciousness. Historically, the other reason the Indian middle class was reactionary was because it was a class that saw the license Raj as being something that closed off opportunities for them because they saw that the license Raj was deeply corrupt. And unless you had connections inside the Congress Party, you couldn't get a license to build your business, to start up a new venture. So that's why the BJP, and the Swatantra Party were both parties housed in the Indian. I don't think there's anything mysterious about this, so I'm not sure what the point of the question is. You seem to think that Marxism can't explain why people are reactionary. It is single-mindedly devoted to explaining why people are reactionary. So I hope that answers your question. The question just kind of confused me. Now, आपका जो question था यूरोप के बारे में, हाथ उठाओ कौन किसका? I mean, let me just put it slightly differently. ये बात नहीं है कि यूरोप में pre-capitalist modes हैं और इंडिया में भी हैं और post-colonial theories के बारे में कुछ बोल नहीं पाती. I would put it differently, which is that post-colonial theory का जो capitalism का जो अंदाज़ा है, जो जिस रूप से वो capitalism को present करते हैं, वो कहीं भी कभी भी हकीकत नहीं थी. कहीं भी ऐसा capitalism दुनिया में आज तक नहीं आया है जिसको लेके वो कहते हैं ये capitalism. So it isn't a question of post-colonial theory not being able to say something about feudal remnants. Is that post-colonial theory doesn't even have an adequate model of what capitalism is.
Because all capitalisms everywhere have been very mixed, very heterogeneous. अगर आप मेरी किताब पढ़ें उसमें मैं इसका काफ़ी लंबा मैंने elaborate किया. The basic point you're making is absolutely right. I would just frame it slightly differently. It's not that post-colonial theory का feudal remnants के बारे में कुछ बोलने का नहीं है. इसकी capitalism itself के बारे में कुछ बोलने का नहीं है. It's just a jumble of garbage. Now the final question. See, you asked several questions in the final question. It ended with, what do I think the Democrats should do? I won't answer every part of your question because it was, kind of many places. Let me make an observation that's related to your question, and you tell me if it addresses some of it. You're right, kuch log kehte hain ki Kamala Harris went too far left. Now, how is that remotely possible? How could that be? It's because the meaning of the word left has changed in America. So, the kind of crazy identity politics that has alienated most Americans is now called left-wing politics. Of course, Zoran's program is also called left-wing, but they do a little verbal trick. What they'll say is, polls show that the Democratic Party is too far to the left. Now, what are those polls asking people? Do you think everybody should change their pronoun because of trans rights? This is a left-wing position. Do you think that America is fundamentally driven by racism and it's a racist society? That's called a left-wing position. People react negatively to these things. Because they react negatively, they say they're rejecting leftism. But then you ask the same people, do you support Medicare for all? Do you support free housing? Do you support cheap groceries? They say yes. Now, मैं आपसे ये पूछता हूँ, which of those two is left wing? And what did Kamala Harris run on? She ran on identity politics. I mean, truth is she didn't run on it, but she was associated with identity politics. And that's then taken as a justification by the Democratic Party leadership to say, we can't be left wing because people hate left wing. They've rebranded identity politics as left wing, and so they use that rebranding to reject economic redistribution. That's the problem. So what do I say to the Democrats? The Democrats are not going to change. किसी ने बात उठाई नहीं है, but let me just say it. The Democrats will go down. They will lose the next 10 elections if they have to, rather than concede to Zoran and Bernie Sanders. The only way the Democrats change is if power is taken from the existing leadership by these insurgent forces. It's building a little bit. I don't know if that's possible yet. But that party will never move to what I would call the left. Never. Because it's just much too much of the grips of American capital and these mobilized upper middle class professionals, both of which have one thing in common: they absolutely detest the poor, whether black, brown, or white.
Hi, Ram here. So I was thinking about the prospect of universalism associated with organizing. So I was thinking about the citizenship concerns which has emerged all over the world. Thinking about, for example, the anti-immigrant movement or the politics of disenfranchisement going on not just in India but all over the world. So in these kind of scenarios, we see that there will be surplus of labor, very precarious, and even the working class organizing, or even most of the even communist positioning, will have to revolve around the question of nationality and all of this. Then between all these kind of difficult positions, what is the prospect of organizing among the most vulnerable, who are consistently being thrown out from the universalist values of even citizenship rights?
Yeah, hello. So taking on that question of dignity versus merit, and then you said that a proposed idea would be that if, let's say, a middle class person gets the earning wage, basic medical health care, transportation, or maybe even housing, and that's all they really want, and that's not necessarily what they have a problem with when they articulate dignity. Now, just thinking from
not
there,
middle class, working class.
I think in answering that, you said that most people, when they think about dignity, they don't necessarily mean that merit has to go away for dignity to, I mean, there has to be this kind of a middle ground where you just need a job, basic medical health care, transportation, housing, etc. And then that's a basic ask, saying that you shouldn't just, whatever, like this is exactly what you said, right? So I'm taking this ahead to just think about what work means today. I think the nature of work is fundamentally shifting in a lot of ways, and I don't know how much of, job is something that's going to give me dignity in lots of ways, right? So I'm also just thinking about land and the kind of politics around land, which is sort of thickened even now, because there are even more number of stakeholders who want to grab land in different ways, and then the kind of politics of land grab that we see in cities, or just even like, you can't even like theorize cities in the same way anymore. I mean, the kind of urbanization that's happening is across, and the way land is then contested is also happening in different ways. So how do we then look at even, claims beyond things like jobs, and then claims to land, in some sense of a land redistribution, then also connecting it to caste again, and just, trying to think.
Thank you for the talk. My question is regarding like how you address the problem of pronouns, and also while answering to his question, you are addressing though you didn't explicitly mention, you were talking about affirmative action in some sense. Some groups asserting their rights to government offices and posts. My question is with regard to, while there is a necessity to address class issues in contemporary social movements and politics, do we necessarily have to set these terms in antagonistic ways? That identity politics is all bad and we have some kind of, redemptive class based politics. And why can't we, also accommodate the concerns of identity politics? Because, using pronouns is not merely, a lifestyle issue or something. This is quite, these are gender and sexuality and caste concerns emerge from certain normative ways of living. And I don't think we are going to lose anything by accommodating these issues instead of, setting them in antagonistic terms. I mean, what do you think about that?
Ram's question. It's very difficult. You're right. It's extremely difficult right now in figuring out how to address the immigrant question in a way that's realistic. Because if you just say open all the borders, let anyone in, you're handing over power to fascism sooner or later. So you have to be realistic about it, but at the same time, you have to also understand that immigrants are usually the most vulnerable and the most liable to be abused when you have strict immigration requirements. I think I would say at a very broad level, Ram, that there's three components that go into dealing with this. One is that you have to recognize reality. You cannot, the left, at this moment, tactically can't have an open borders position. It's just tactically impossible to do that. So you have to have some kind of controlled entry of immigrants. Secondly, you have to understand that the xenophobia that's overtaking Europe right now and the United States is not cultural, it's materially rooted. And on this, there's very good scholarship. All the places where the far right is gaining power in Europe, it's actually, there's fantastic work showing the electoral map of where the far right is gaining seats. It's all places where you have a combination of job loss and the rolling back of social welfare benefits. The xenophobia is rooted in actual material concerns that people have. That means that in addition to regulating the entry of labor, the labor movements in these countries have to revitalize those social benefits and the security of working people. That makes them less prone to see immigrants as an economic threat to them. And everywhere where immigrants are being brought in, the first thing people bring up is their
threat to their jobs or they're draining public benefits. Now, if you're in a context where those public benefits are disappearing, there's a material basis to those fears. And then the third thing is this. I really do think that you have to address directly the vulnerability of immigrants. And the way you do that is you have a robust system of labor rights for anybody who's employed, whether they're nationalized, whether they're naturalized citizens, born citizens, or non-citizens. Everybody has the same labor rights. Because it's not just workers who are threatened by immigrants. It's also employers who take advantage of the fact that immigrants are unable to seek recourse in the courts when they're abused. So in order to give them the chance to actually have decent jobs and be treated well, the labor rights regime all across the world has to be one that doesn't make the distinction between citizens and non-citizens. Labor rights have to be employment-based and universal. That will also then therefore make the immigrants less vulnerable. Right now, I think it has to be these three things are the essential components to addressing the immigration issue. I did not understand the second question, because I don't understand why the bringing in land into the equation changes anything. People work. Work is an essential component to your dignity, including when you're working on land. At least that's the way I see it. People do get a sense of self out of meaningful and dignified labor. Now, it's another matter that all over India, there's a scramble for urban land. Of course that's true, but that's just because it is an insanely insecure environment where people are seeking to gain whatever assets they can. So, in that environment, I think the solution, again, is some kind of social wage, access to housing, which makes the competition over resources less intense than it is now. And then you threw in, and think about caste, I don't even know what that means, so I'm not going to address the caste issue. I've already addressed it in the previous questions. And the final question, somebody always asks this. There is no antagonism between the pursuit of racial justice and class, but of course there's an antagonism between identity politics and social justice, because identity politics is the aspirations of the rich. I do not understand why that's hard to absorb. There is a choice between race and ethnic justice if it's limited to the needs of the rich, and race and ethnic justice if it's to be universal. The reason you're asking the question is you refuse to accept that identity politics is exclusive and narrow. You keep accepting their definition of it, which is that identity politics is about race or gender. It's not. It is about the wealthier elements within those sections. And I think the left has to be unapologetic. Yeah, there's an absolute antagonism between the needs of wealthy black and brown people and the needs of working class black and brown people. This is just the ABCs of progressivism. I'll just leave it at that.
The questions are getting worse, so I think they're running out.
Okay, this is the final round of questions. Sorry, we are running out of time, so final round of questions. You already asked a question, so I'm sorry. I don't see any hands. Okay.
Yeah.
You said identity politics is basically of wealthy people, and can't there be lower class people, lower caste people who, like in the context of caste, so they are poor, they are asking for dignity, they are asking for respect. You are saying that these are only of rich people, but
please just stop.
Like, can there not be Ambedkarite thought which can offer other than the left wing you are saying?
मैं हिंदी में बोलता हूँ, सबको अच्छी तरह से समझ आ जाए।
जी बताइए।
मैंने ये नहीं बोला है कि डिग्निटी की स्ट्रगल जो है वो केवल अमीरों की है। मैंने कहा जिस ढंग से अमीर इसको एड्रेस करते हैं वो अलग होगा गरीबों से। मुझे समझ नहीं आ रहा है ये क्यों इतना मुश्किल है समझने में।
किस तरीके से अलग है?
भैया अगर आपको डिस्क्रिमिनेशन से लगी हुई है, अगर आप लैंडलेस लेबरर हैं और आपके साथ डिस्क्रिमिनेशन हो रही है और डिस्क्रिमिनेशन को हटा दिया, you're still a landless laborer। गरीब फिर भी होना, तो आपकी डिमांड्स यही नहीं होंगी
कि हमें लैंडलेस लेबरर्स में से डिस्क्रिमिनेट ना किया जाए। योर डिमांड विल बी हमें कुछ हक हैं, कुछ अधिकार हैं जो हमें मिलने चाहिए, जो कि अमीरों को ऑलरेडी प्राप्त हो गए। I'm sorry if I'm sounding impatient, but this is when your own class aspirations come out. It should not be difficult to understand that the way poor lower castes, poor women, poor ethnicities understand and experience their oppression is going to be different from the way the wealthy do. The search for dignity, you're absolutely right, is cross-class. But the programs for how to address the dignity are going to be affected by the class orientations and the class commitments of the people articulating them. This was common to left common sense for 100 years. I'm just trying to re-present it now as something to think about.
That's all the time that we have. On behalf of JNU Academic, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Professor Vivek Chibber for his thought-provoking lecture. His insights have not only deepened our understanding of materialism's relevance in the contemporary world, but have also reminded us the urgent need to claim values of reason and universalism. A heartfelt thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us today and participating in this important conversation. Your presence affirms that this space for critical engagement is alive, even as it faces increasing constraints. We are especially grateful to Chairperson of Center for Informal Studies and Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, and to the Dean of School of Social Sciences for making this space available. In a time when broader space for democratic deliberation is steadily shrinking, this gesture affirms the university's role as a site of open inquiry and critical thought. Thank you once again, and to everyone who made this event possible. Just I have a couple of announcements to make. One is, on August 4th, Professor Nidhi Nair will be discussing her book, Her Sentiments, Secularism and Belonging in South Asia. Joining her will be Professor Vidhu Verma and Dr. Amir Ali. And second, and more important announcement is, there's tea and biscuits right outside. Please have it before you leave. Thank you very much.